When I first joined the Catholic Church, I heard a homily given by one of the more prominent priests in my Archdiocese, which was probably, I think it was fairly formative for me because it's remained with me and evidently still occurs to me today, as it reminded me in the preparation for this video, in which he took the opportunity at one point to fire some shots at traditionalists. He said something like, "Those traditionalists think they are the most faithful because they prefer the Latin Mass. But if they were really committed to tradition, then you'd think they would prefer that the Mass be said in Greek or in Hebrew, like at the Last Supper." The Latin Mass, he went on to explain, didn't appear until 1500 years later. That's not traditional, that's modern. And people living in the age of the apostles probably would have seen it as foreign and unfamiliar to their traditional practices. To which I thought, yeah, those Latin Mass people are so stupid. By the way, the Latin Mass is much older than the 16th century, but that's beside the point. And this sentiment from that homily stuck with me for a long time until I was introduced to both the fallacy and the accusation, as well as a less narrow-minded rendering of tradition. Because according to this priest, the older some belief or custom is, the more traditional it is. For him, the measure of your commitment to tradition was based on how remote your practices are from the contemporary age, how far back they go in time. And since the Last Supper was the oldest version of the Mass, if you want to be a traditionalist, you should either be promoting some version of that exclusively, or just admit that you're a modernist like everyone else. And this is actually a pretty savage way of deflating a traditionalist because it seemingly outperforms him at his own game. It's a way of positioning yourself as even more traditional than the person who prides themselves on their adherence to tradition, exposing him as just another progressive from a different era, LARPing or pretending to be traditional, when in fact, you're the one who goes back all the way, even further than he does. You hold to the real tradition that is more ancient and more obscure than his. But that's a pretty egregious false equivalency because that's not what tradition or traditionalism means, and it's certainly not what tradition means in the Catholic sense. Tradition has nothing to do with an infatuation with the oldest thing or the oldest idea. That's closer to primitivism or antiquarianism. A better description of tradition comes from G.K. Chesterton, who draws an analogy with democracy and liberalism, which is a brilliant maneuver of his own because liberalism is an obviously modern and progressive political idea, which has been more than a little contagious in certain anti-traditional theological circles. So Chesterton flips the tables on them by outperforming modernists on their own ground. He starts by identifying what's great about democracy. He says that the most important things to humanity are the things we hold in common and not the things we hold separately, which is why platitudes like "two heads are better than one" are so abiding. Ordinary men should do the things that are common to us ourselves, rather than having experts doing it for us. He quips that we should want to avoid any scenario in which the government is found blowing our noses for us. Based on this, he says that he's never understood why so many modern thinkers think that democracy is somehow antithetical to tradition. He goes on to deliver one of the most quotable lines in all of his considerable corpus when he says, "Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead." The hostile and oppressive exclusion of voices on the margins is contrary to democracy, if not the spirit of democracy. And what better portrays such an attitude than the exclusion of our forefathers? In another spot, Chesterton says, "It is obvious that tradition is only democracy extended through time." And if you really believe that society is best served by the inclusion of a sample size of the largest number of normal everyday people making their preferences known about how best to live in community, then negating the wisdom of all of our ancestors in preference for what Chesterton calls that arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking around, then you aren't democratic at all, you're elitist. If that's you, then sadly you've adopted a wildly unfounded superstition that only the current generation's novel wisdom is valid, and that the countless generations that successfully preceded us have nothing of value to contribute to that question, which again is probably the least democratic attitude you can advance. And to be traditional in this Chestertonian sense, which I'd also argue is the Catholic sense, is to draw inspiration from all of the preceding generations as they succeeded down to us in a harmonious way, and not just the oldest generation, as that false notion of tradition insists. The word Catholic means universal, or more accurately, according to the whole. If you want to be traditional in the Catholic sense, you don't pick and choose from the ancestors you want to listen to. You take it all and you harmonize it. But more recently, there's been a theological school, which my priest friend from the beginning was apparently influenced by, that said, let's go back to the oldest thing, to the beginning, to the exclusion of especially all that stuff that happened in the Middle Ages. This way of thinking in this school of thought has been called the Nouvelle Théologie, which had an obvious prejudice against medieval scholasticism. It wanted to exclude the scholastic contributors to the Church's universal deposit of faith, and instead exclusively focus on the wisdom of the Church Fathers, or the patristics. And at a time when the Church was guarding itself against modernism, which is a serious heresy, it's what Pope St. Pius X called the synthesis of all heresies, this probably seemed like an attractive movement. It was apparently traditional because of its interest in patristics, which are old, but also a breath of fresh air, which might appease certain progressive appetites. But to be anti-scholastic is to negate the profound contribution of doctors and thinkers like Anselm, Albert the Great, Scotus, Bonaventure, and Aquinas. And the thing about these scholastics is that they were traditional in the truest sense. They didn't exclude any of the enduring voices that preceded them. If you read any article from St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae, you'll find countless references to church fathers like Chrysostom, Jerome, and Athanasius. Augustine alone is cited over 3,000 times in the Summa. Scholasticism was universal. If you admit it to the table of tradition, you get the church fathers thrown in with it. But the Nouvelle Théologie and this false notion of tradition wanted only the church fathers, and only what they liked from the church fathers, not the insights those medieval rationalists were able to extract from them. They want suffrage, but not universal suffrage, just votes for them and their buddies. They only want to admit certain voices to the table, which isn't democracy, it's oligarchy, and it's certainly not compatible with the word Catholic. Tradition is one of the three pillars of the church, along with scripture and the magisterium. If any of those pillars are neglected or disproportionate to the others, the whole enterprise topples over. To be Catholic is to be traditional. And yes, there are a lot of people who assume the identity of traditionalist, who are a poor representation of what that means and what it means to be Catholic or a follower of Jesus. But that doesn't mean we need to make a stigma out of tradition. That's like taking the worst examples of any people group and treating them as representative of the whole, which has always been the rhetorical maneuver that gives permission to the worst forms of bigotry. I'm a traditionalist because I'm Catholic, because tradition means the preservation of the timeless faith given to the apostles, witnessed to by the fathers, articulated by the scholastics, and for some reason resented and even rejected by moderns. And if I may say so, that isn't working too well for the church or society. Tradition is where life, wisdom, and faith are found. If you're a Catholic, rediscover the whole tradition, and commit yourself to communities that honor it. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year, and if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support, or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.